Hello, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. This is our weekly installment from the Virsec Security Labs on our weekly vulnerability analysis, joined as always by Satya Gupta, our founder and CTO. So Satya, can you give us the overview? I know we've been looking at about 5 top vulnerabilities every week with the analysis. So what's come up in the last week?
Hi, Willie. Good to meet again. This week I have, let me share my screen here. I've picked out a few vulnerabilities that have these 6 vulnerabilities actually. The top 5 are in application, and the sixth one is in security control itself. So the confused deputy problem out here. So what I've picked out is, let me go through in detail here. So the first one that I picked out is called the WebLogic RC, the remote code execution issue with using a GET request. And as you can see that the criticality of this is very high. It's got a score of 9.8. And there's a public domain exploit available for all of this stuff. So it is really an OS command injection vulnerability that can very easily be exploited, as you can see in the public exploit out here. And the WebLogic servers that are affected are, a very wide range. Many of these servers existed, several years ago as well. Many of these versions. So, this has been a problem for a long-standing problem, and it's a very high criticality score. So this is one of the reasons to pick it up. And because a public domain exploit exists, you can expect, a whole bunch of people to be able to exploit this vulnerability. There's of course the VerseX security platform would be able to protect against a command injection type of vulnerabilities. So we have the ability to protect both at the host layer and at the VSP web layer, where we can block this attack at a very early stage. So it has very little dwell time, if any.
And Satya, it seems like remote code execution seems to be a growing theme here, and the ones obviously we're talking about, but is this becoming worse and worse?
Absolutely. These vulnerabilities are how the attacker seizes control of the application, and then once they've got control of the application, then if they can put something down on your server, that's how they achieve persistence. And then, and it's a matter of, it's game over at that point in time. They put some malware on your endpoints, and then that malware can do bad things locally, or it can provide a conduit for them to keep coming back and visiting that server and seeing what they can exploit at that moment of time. So stage 2 of the attack. Stage 1 is, of course, getting execution control, which is what this vulnerability was all about. And then after that, getting to the next stage and doing various things with it is, something that the attacker has control over the narrative. But as soon as they get control, execution control, it's game over at that point.
They can do anything, run ransomware, hijack a system.
Yeah, establish command control with their own command control center, keep sending it's what the APT groups are all about. We've heard of the famous APT3, APT29 groups. This is what it's all about.
Okay, so what's next here?
So the next vulnerability I've picked here is in a product called Ruckus VDI. It's very often it's used for third-party IoT management, software. It has, again, this term, this RC that we were just referring to out here is mentioned out here as well. So this particular product has the ability to, get under, it can be, we can actually use some publicly available exploit that is available, very easily available here. To be able to go and seize control of the OT infrastructure of an enterprise. And of course, we have VerseX will be able to protect against these kind of problems. We have this host monitoring capability that will absolutely protect against this vulnerability.
And this Ruckus device, this is it's not on a proprietary OS. How do we get in there to protect it?
So this vulnerability is, it's running on an x86 machine, so we could actually protect it on a.
Oh, I see. There's an IoT controller. Got it. Okay. Interesting. So all this worry about IoT and smart homes, there's
yes.
a big target there potentially.
Absolutely, it's a fertile ground for people to for an attacker to come in and invade deeper and deeper into the, into your homes and all also.
Right. Okay, now we're on to WordPress. WordPress seems to pop up a lot. I know it's a hugely popular platform, open source, but what have we got here?
So we have there is blog functionality in in one of the plugins of WordPress, and what it does is basically allows you keep on hammering that particular vulnerability with again and again. You keep on asking the same question. It's almost like a denial of service kind of attack. So once you do it long enough, the WordPress the database in the backend gets disconnected, and then WordPress believes that there's a new installation going on, so it presents you the ability to put up your own code essentially at that point. So it really gives you, the attacker, the ability to completely obliterate a given website essentially.
Okay, and if that website's connected to other back-end sensitive data, that can be a serious risk, not just for the website, right?
Totally. And you can redirect code, make totally a new website appear with the, you can launch, some trusted website, an alternate website, and that could be your drive-by downloader for, people show up out there, and, it has malware on it. It gets downloaded on your machine, and, it just gets worse and worse from that point onwards.
Okay.
And of course, Virsec Security Platform has support for all of this. We can actually totally protect, some new files and new code being ever being written onto the server.
Okay.
The next vulnerability that I've picked is in the Oracle Business Intelligence suite, essentially. So this is a local file injection type of vulnerability. So a lot of people believe that their applications that are running inside the Oracle Fusion middleware are what they really need to protect, but these components, these frameworks are also vulnerable. And as you can see here, the base CVS Score of this particular vulnerability is very high, and it's been around for a while out, I guess. And there are of course publicly available exploits present, that can be used to exploit this. So the net outcome here is that and we'll talk about it later in another spreadsheet that I will be discussing out there. It presents a fairly high risk rating. Essentially, it can compromise your infrastructure completely. And so the important point here is that that Oracle Business Suite is used by very large there's a preponderance of Fortune 100 companies that get that will be able to use Oracle and related applications. So this will absolutely affect Fortune 100 companies a lot.
So big companies with a lot to risk.
Yes.
And we've seen Oracle twice today with the WebLogic and here.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the good news is that the VSP web component can actually totally protect against this kind of an attack. So nothing to worry about for Virsec users.
Okay.
The fifth vulnerability that I've picked is in a product called Manage Engine, which is used by IT a lot to, it's an ability to go and receive alerts and logs from various endpoints that IT is managing essentially.
Okay.
So we can use this this vulnerability to go and run arbitrary code at all infrastructure that's connected to this Manage Engine product. And of course, as you can see here, this particular vulnerability has a very high critical score. And a public domain exploit exists for this particular vulnerability. So it's a no-brainer. Even script kiddies can potentially use this capability. And it is related to a SQL injection vulnerability in that engine. And as you know, with the VerseX Security Platform, SQL injection is very well protected. So all VerseX customers can relax with their peace of mind that they would be actually having full coverage on this.
Okay.
Vulnerability. The last one I picked is kind of different because it's this is a Winston IoT RC. It's if you go to the company's website, they will show you how in an IoT in scenario you could actually use their product to filter what you'll see on the internet. So it's like protects the OT from being visited by uh, you know uh, from random attackers essentially.
Okay, but
So
yet
this is
allows these systems to be connected to the internet in some way.
exactly, and
Okay.
it filters how what who's allowed, and it's almost like a firewall in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this particular product, it's a security control. People use it to protect their infrastructure. So it's bad news if they have any vulnerabilities in those kind of products. It has in this particular case, it has a score of 9.8, which is very super critical. And of course, a public exploit is available for this particular vulnerability, so it makes it even more necessary to upgrade as soon as possible.
Okay.
So that's all I picked for this week, Willie. But I want to show you something that's
Yeah,
very
we mentioned this last week, and this is a new framework, I guess, you've put together to come up with an aggregate risk index, essentially, that's more comprehensive maybe than that CVSS number that was out there. Is that right?
exactly. The CVSS number basically doesn't take into account prevalence, how frequent this particular application, how many people use that application, and whether there's a publicly available exploit available or not. They do in an indirect way, but it's uh, this is something that we need to be able to put into our um, people don't essentially relate to their circumstances, and this fact that there is a publicly available exploit changes over time essentially. So I might see in the NVD charts today that the score is the score is subdued because at that point in time the exploit was not available. But given time and people who are working on those exploits can actually publish their exploit on the internet, and so the score can change. So we kind of rate our score, essentially our risk score is slightly different. It basically the severity, the CVSS score basically talks about a weakness in the application and how severe that weakness is, but it doesn't really tell you how exploitable that particular weakness would be. So there
So
are
can you
some
maybe, sorry, step us through these columns, Satya, these factors that you're putting into that?
absolutely. So what I did is that those 6 vulnerabilities that we discussed, I have them represented in column B and the corresponding CV number essentially. So you could click on any of these to land there. So I put some parameters here. I put this parameter called prevalence. If if an application is being used by a Fortune 100 company and is being produced by a Fortune 100 company, that bumps it up to a high prevalence, a rating of 10 essentially. Another reason to publish to bump it up to 10 is when you have open source, commonly used open source applications that are, let's say, under an Apache license or a Berkeley license, for instance, BSD license and all. So those would be one that are heavily used and contributed to, and so they get sucked into pretty much every product that gets released by an enterprise. So I rate them at a very high prevalence. The attack vectors, there are 3 choices out here. The attacker could be located across the globe, in which case they would be attacking over the network, or they could be on an adjacent machine. Having attacked one machine, they could creep onto the next machine, in which case it's a little harder to do that. So I've rated it at 5. And then you could be on that specific machine that you are targeting, and then you could attack an adjacent process, not just an adjacent server, but an adjacent process on that same server. So that is you'd have to be able to jump through many hoops before you can start doing that. So I've rated it at local attacks as 1.
Right. So if it's something that requires an insider, that's going to be less likely than something that's exposed to any attackers anywhere.
Exactly.
Right.
And so the attack complexity, if it is very low, if it's not a complex attack, it has to be, it doesn't require, many moving parts essentially. When it is low, then it requires very few moving parts. So it's something that that gets rated at high. So I was assigned a score of 10 for, when it is low. And when there's very complex attack and all that, then it is really a lot more harder to carry out. So that's why I kind of assigned it a risk score of 1 instead of 10.
Sure.
And if in the next column is this privilege required, so when you need to be at a root user, for instance, and it's harder to get somebody's some admin's credentials as opposed to some user's credentials. So if you can actually get some user's credential, you'd actually it's not really rated at a high level essentially. So if I have an attack which does not require an admin's creds and all, that would make it a more juicy target. So that's for that reason I've assigned the none, no privilege required as attack. Somebody who can just walk in out there, no matter who is running that process, it gets attacked. I would rate it at 10 at that point.
Okay.
And user interaction, if I, typically on a server, there is no user available pretty much, right? So if you have a user interaction required, that makes it a little bit difficult. You'd have to be able to somehow be able to persuade that user to do what the attacker wants them to do. So user, when an attack doesn't require user interaction, it becomes more dangerous because, there's no barrier to attacking the application per se.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So user interaction would require someone to respond to a click on something or respond to a phishing email, something like that, right? But none means it's just can happen automatically.
And that's what makes server attacks a lot more dangerous because, if you think about it, your own laptop is sitting behind a router in your office. And, you'd have to first be able to abuse the router, and then you can come in further. Just makes it a little bit harder. It's
sure.
More moving parts have to be attacked essentially in that sense.
Sure.
If I have a server that's running, 24/7, it's exposed on the internet, then it's more likely to get abused.
Okay. And then scope, what does this mean?
So scope is basically, what piece of information is getting abused. Essentially, if I can change my scope, if I can come in and it's almost like by acquiring the attack. Basically, if let's say I have access to some part of the database, and then I can abuse the vulnerability, and I can get access to some other part of the database which I shouldn't have been able to get to. That is where the scope. If an attack succeeds in changing the scope, then it's a little bit more dangerous because now more information is exposed essentially to the attacker.
I see. Okay, so it's how much they can open up from that point to additional.
How many more doors they can open up essentially.
Got it. Okay.
And so the next column is this confidentiality. If I can get to some highly confidential information, then the score is 10. It's a high. Whereas if I can get to like in famous attacks like Equifax, you might have heard people, respond back and saying, not highly sensitive information was not disclosed or divulged and all that. So this is what this is all about. Can I get to how much information am I getting to?
Sure. And this also brings up compliance violations and all kinds of additional pain for companies.
Exactly.
It's highly confidential.
Absolutely.
And then integrity, what does this mean?
So if I can actually spoil the integrity, like for instance, if I have a ransomware, I can completely corrupt, executables and files that are sitting. So the integrity of all of those, of that content gets totally destroyed essentially. So if I have the ability to destroy the integrity of an application, I'd rate it as a higher, a more potent attack essentially. Okay. Whereas if I could not go and affect, the contents on the disk and all that, I couldn't change the file's contents and all, I'd rate it at 1.
Okay.
And as far as availability is concerned, if I am able to intrude on that server and I can actually make, that particular application go under a denial of service kind of an attack, or not really a denial of service, but a denial, it's not available, denial of resources essentially. So I could pound that particular server, and then other people who are legitimate users of that server would not be able to get that box, or I could make the box crash, and then so anything that makes all the possible servers crash essentially would be rated high. So that's why I've given something that compromises the availability of a server is rated as a high here.
Okay, and then you talked about the publicly available exploit. That's clear. That now this process, I know researchers legitimately come up with these exploits and post them, right, in order for the companies to respond and react.
And in fact, the National Vulnerability Database will not, just arbitrarily, accept a vulnerability from some white hat attacker, for instance. So they would, they would like to be able to discover how that attacker is going to attack and how abuse that. And the National Vulnerability Database owes it to the vendor to be able to demonstrate that that there's a really and truly an attack present out there. So even the vendor of the software could potentially dispute that, but once it when the exploit becomes available and it is easy to exploit, nobody can deny this anymore, right? So the vendor cannot hide behind obscurity out there. They just dispute for no reason, essentially.
So it's obviously a double-edged sword. I mean, of course, you need to publish these things so that we can protect against them, but then it makes it easier for anybody to exploit it, right?
Exactly. And in many cases where there's very heavy impact out there, the National Vulnerability Database will say that there is an exploit available, but they won't release it. It's about being responsible out there.
Okay.
In fact, many companies, I think Google Project Zero has this 90-day moratorium that they impose, that after 90 days they will publish the exploit, so that if puts a little bit pressure on the vendor to go fix it.
Okay. All right, Satya. So wrapping this up, this seems like a much more comprehensive way looking at all of these 10 factors. So if something comes out 9 or above, like most of these have, yes, then it's it's red almost across the boards except for one factor.
Yeah.
So this seems like a very useful way to give a quick or a broader view of the total risk, correct?
Absolutely. 9 means, it's crying out for help here. So, it's just waiting to be exploited. It's like good pickings for even unsophisticated attackers.
All right, well, thank you, Satya. So we will, of course, be publishing both the report and we'll be compiling this new framework and adding to it, and we'll find ways, we'll make it available certainly online, and we'll find additional ways to aggregate that score over time. So thank you again, Satya. Very interesting content as always, and thank you to the audience. Please tune in next week and read our blogs, and we'll continue to try to do this good work. Thank you, Satya.
Thank you.